What's the most bizarre coincidence you've ever experienced? Part 3. Years ago, my PC was failing as I was finishing up an important report for my master's degree. Time was extremely tight. At one point, my mouse port stopped working, and being nearly broke, I needed to find a USB to PS2 converter, the cheapest way to get my mouse working again. I slipped on my sneakers and walked about a mile from the dorms to a tech shop to see if they had the piece I needed. If they didn't, I'd have to go to another tech store farther away, and I wasn't looking forward to spending the afternoon trekking around town trying to find a part one needed. As I stepped out of the main door of my dorms, I noticed something on the ground. It looked like a USB to PS2 converter. I picked it up. It was exactly what I needed. Thinking someone must have thrown it away because it didn't work, I went back to my room to try it out. It worked perfectly, and I was able to get back to work on my report about 90 seconds after leaving my dorm. I don't recall ever seeing a USB to PS2 converter just lying on the ground before, and I certainly haven't seen one since. I have no idea what the odds are of finding something like that discarded on the ground at a moment when I needed it and was seriously against the clock. About 12 years ago, I was at the Glastonbury Festival. I went alone, met up with some friends, and had a great time as always. About 10 days later, I received an email from a woman I had dated a few years prior. I hadn't heard from her since we parted ways. The email had the subject line, "Is this you?" Attached to the email was a photograph. The photo showed me passing by her camera. She had also been at the festival, watching the Stranglers on the other stage at Glastonbury. She snapped a picture of the stage just as I walked past her camera, beer in hand. My hair had grown quite a bit. I was wearing a hat and sunglasses, but she recognized my pierced ear. There were around 170,000 people there that year, and I happened to walk past her just as she took a photo. I have an apricot tree in my front yard. My dog Peach used to jump the 6-foot fence and bark at my mailman, so when I found out my mailman liked apricots, I started giving him some to make up for my unfriendly dog. I adopted another dog whom I named Porkchop, and he escaped from my backyard after about 6 weeks. I had just gotten out of the house for the first time after having so I hadn't been able to get him a collar or tag with his name on it. Porkchop was missing for a month, and I literally plastered my neighborhood and next door with flyers, postcards, anything I could find to find Porkchop. No luck. After a month, I received a strange, secretive text from someone saying they were contacting me on behalf of their friend. The friend possibly saw my dog in a specific yard but was afraid to talk to the people because they were rough. I sat in my car for a few hours to watch their house, and they realized what I was doing because they skulked around. Still, I kept watching that area. Another month passed, and the person who had Porkchop showed up. It was a woman who lived at the house. Porkchop used to be her dog, but they had abandoned him at the shelter with some issues, and I adopted him. The woman said she had wanted to keep him, but I wouldn't give up. One day, I'm in my front yard with the dogs and Porkchop, and the mailman walks by and says, "You got him back," and told me how he was the one who sent me the secret message. He remembered me by my apricots and recalled my posters. The apricots saved the day. Never forget that a small gesture of kindness towards another human being can pay off someday.
I was 17 and still had braces. On vacation from Pennsylvania to Tampa, I ran into my orthodontist at an amusement park. He was with a very attractive woman whom he didn't directly introduce me to. My braces were removed shortly after I got home, almost as if he didn't want me in the office any longer.
I called a friend of mine one day, back in the 90s, so landline. Right as his phone was about to ring, he casually picked up and dialed my number, unaware we were already on a call together. In the 90s, my friend Steve and I met up in Baltimore to go to an Orioles game. I arrived a little late to the agreed-upon bar, and Steve said he had been there a while and was talking to a young couple who had left for the game before I arrived. We scalped some bleacher tickets and entered the stadium hoping to upgrade to better seats during the game. This was just a year or two after Camden Yards opened and it was packed for every game, so we weren't very optimistic, but by chance, I spotted a couple of empty seats about 20 rows behind the first base dugout. We made our way over there, and I asked the girl next to the empty seats if anyone was using them. She turned around, looked at us, and said, "Oh my God, it's Steve." Out of around 45,000 seats in a packed stadium, we casually found empty seats next to the couple Steve had been talking to at the bar.
The adoptive aunt and uncle of my husband were friends with the biological aunt and uncle for years without realizing it. One Christmas, they were both at a party when someone else mentioned adoption. The adoptive aunt and uncle mentioned they had a sister who had adopted a baby. The biological aunt and uncle mentioned they had a sister who had given her baby up for adoption. When they went into details, the year, the city, the hospital, the date of birth, they realized it was the same baby. My husband and his biological mother did a DNA test to confirm it, as obtaining adoption records would take up to 8 months. And now my husband has 2 incredible mothers, I have 2 incredible mothers-in-law, and our children are spoiled with 3 grandmothers.
This didn't happen to me personally, but to my neighbor. He lost a fishing lure when he failed to catch a fish, and shortly after, the same fish jumped out of the water, spitting the lure out of its mouth and landing in my neighbor's lap. He was lucky there were 3 other people in the boat as witnesses.
I was helping my husband's sister move into her new home, which was an old 1800s post office that had been converted into a duplex. We knew there was a couple living in the other half, but we didn't know who they were. We were unloading stuff from the moving truck when the neighbor came out and shouted my name. It was my sister's former roommate. I lived next to a family who had a small black dog. When their son moved out, he took the dog with him. We still live next to the family. My current boyfriend told me how his neighbor wasn't taking care of his dog, so he had been feeding it for months and ended up adopting it. It was the same dog that had lived next to me when I was growing up. So my mom lives next to my boyfriend's parents. Furthermore, my mom has a close friend whom I've known all my life, and my boyfriend has been good friends with her son for years. It's amazing to think how our paths have crossed in that way.
I went to some extracurricular classes. The teacher had the same last name as mine. My aunt's first name, had a son with the same name as mine, and this boy played the same instrument as I did, and they lived so close that we were practically neighbors. The teacher had a neighbor who was another teacher teaching exactly the same subject. Both houses looked the same. Additionally, we were almost neighbors to other teachers who taught at the school I was in. I'm living in the Matrix. I met a group of people in York, England, when I was there on vacation with my friend a few years ago. I ran into the same group in Glasgow about a week later at a random bar we walked into. That night we all ended up very drunk. Last year I was at a bar in a neighboring city. I was there with a friend, and I saw my most recent ex-girlfriend walk into the bar. We didn't say anything to each other, and she didn't seem to mind, but her friends were giving me looks and causing a bit of a scene. So, we decided to leave and head to another bar around the corner, and who do I see? My previous ex-girlfriend whom I had just run into. So, she and I awkwardly greeted each other, and I went to get a drink. And who shows up? The other ex-girlfriend and her group of friends. So, I had 2 exes, who had never met, in the same bar, at the same time, in a neighboring city from where we all lived. A few years ago, I met my most recent ex-girlfriend's parents, considering that my ex lived an hour and a half away in another state. Somehow, we got to talking about my single life before I met my ex. So, I told them about the last date I had, how boring this girl was, and how she owned a horse farm. The dad said his work buddy had just started talking to a girl who owned a horse farm. It turns out that as we talked, we started piecing things together. I looked her up on Facebook, not really believing it could be the same girl, but it absolutely was. What are the odds of my ex's dad's coworker starting to date a girl I had just gone on a date with a month ago, an hour and a half away? We all ended up laughing, and about 6 months later, I found out they had broken up. I work at a tire shop. A lady called to pick up a set of 4 tires for her boyfriend to install. No problem, people do that all the time. However, she was very rude throughout the entire phone call, said she'd be there at 5:50. She arrived at 5:50, a very rude woman walked in and asked for the tires she had called about earlier. I said, "Let me just grab those real quick," as I dashed back and brought them all to the counter. She looked very surprised as she pointed at them and said, "These aren't for my car." At the same time, my coworker looked at the tires I had brought and told me the lady he was working with was picking those up. One was picking up tires for her Ford Escape, while the other was getting tires for a Chevy Cobalt. What had happened was both of them called. Both sounded alike. Both had nearly identical "I'm a tough independent who takes no crap from anyone" personalities. One called me, and the other called my coworker, and both were picking up cash tires for their boyfriends to install. It turned out to be the same boyfriend, and they had an argument in the parking lot. I met this girl at a bar, we hit it off, and ended up drunkenly kissing. I added her as a friend on Facebook and saw she had a boyfriend. A couple of years later, I was talking to another girl for a while. Things didn't work out, and we both moved on with our lives. I checked the Facebook of that girl a year later and see she's engaged to that same guy the first girl was dating at the time.
My close friend, who was also my neighbor at the time, and I were just chilling at her house one day when her uncle from jail called to talk to her dad, who lived with her. Her dad walked into the room and said to my friend, "It's uncle," said to send his regards. Out of curiosity, I casually asked my friend why her uncle was in jail, to which she replied, for murdering and sexually abusing some woman, but he didn't do it. I said, "Oh, wouldn't his name be?" I said a name. She turned her head so fast and said, "Yes." "Oh my God, how did you know?" I said, "Oh my God, she was my second cousin." So yeah, one of my best friend's uncles murdered one of my relatives years before we met and became friends. We were both just kids when the incident happened. I remember seeing it on the news. We both sat there in complete shock, like, are we still friends? How does this work? Unbelievable. We're still friends to this day. Her uncle is still serving a life sentence.
And well, friends, that was all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, let me know with a thumbs up so that YouTube can share these stories with more people. Remember to hit the bell icon to be the first to know when we upload a new video. See you next time.